Hello, and welcome back to my podcast about autism. I really hope you enjoyed the first episode, and today the second episode will be on executive dysfunction. I ask you to take a few moments and remember, when is the last time you forgot your sunglasses? Or when's the last time you forgot your keys? Maybe you left your keys in the car, or maybe you totally forgot something or misplaced something. Now imagine that, but then imagine it happening uncontrollably every single day. This is what autistics deal with. So I think that this is something that a lot of people, especially neurotypicals, don't really comprehend because they don't go through it on a regular basis. So there are some people who unfortunately hear phrases like, everyone's a little bit autistic. That's not how autism works. Autism is a fundamental difference within neurochemistry itself. You can think of it as akin to someone who has a brain injury, perhaps, but also strengths in other areas as well. It's like all of the parts of the brain that are underactive in autism become overactive in other areas. I could go on and on about all of the different types of areas that are affected in autism, but I'll save that for another episode. So, to highlight some of these executive dysfunctions, I am going to explain to you mine that I deal with on a daily basis. So, for 26 years, most of my life, I was literally almost incapable of remembering where I put something. So most people, they set something down, and then a part of their brain actually remembers where the thing that they set down is. And then later on, when they need to use whatever that thing is, they can go back and they know exactly where it is. Even if it's in a place that they wouldn't normally put it. So it took me 26 years to get to the point to be able to heal my brain well enough that I could actually set something down in a different location and remember where it is. And this isn't a symptom or a sign of laziness, like a lot of people seem to think. I guess people think that if you can't remember things, or if you have a poor working memory, that you're somehow lazy, which doesn't really make sense to me, considering it's a physical limitation in the brain. However, I do believe that these physical limitations can be healed with various means, which I'll get into later on. But for now, I want you to really seriously understand that executive dysfunction is not something that we can control. It would be like getting angry at a man with no legs because he can't walk. That's absurd. That's absolutely ridiculous. But that's exactly what it's like being autistic in a neurotypical world. Because people just don't physically comprehend why you wouldn't be able to do basic things. I'll give a few more examples. Some autistic people deal with executive dysfunctions like time blindness. This means not knowing what time it is, not knowing how long something's going to take. This is something I struggled with a little bit, but not as much as other people. For example, your manager says, okay, how long is this task going to take? And for autistics, this is like really a stressful question because it's very difficult many times for us to understand how long something's going to take. Like, it takes as long as it takes. If it takes longer, it takes longer. If it takes shorter, it takes shorter. The idea of trying to assign a time value to that is really tricky. I'll give a few more examples. Since I'm mostly talking about what I guess a lot of people might call high-functioning autism, I don't really particularly like to use that word because I feel like it invalidates a lot of the autistic experience. So if someone is high-functioning, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were always like that, and I think a lot of the effort behind it goes pretty unnoticed. So, for me, my thoughts are almost exclusively nonverbal. So whenever I speak or talk or write of any kind, I have to do this little translation in my head, going from a thought, an idea, to words. And sometimes this translation works out great, and other times it doesn't. Sometimes I try to think of a word, and then I end up with a word that rhymes with it, and I'm just like, how did this even happen? But it's because that areas of the brain that deal with language processing are pretty severely affected in autism. My husband would tell you, if Every time he asks me a question or talks to me, he knows he has to give me at least 5 seconds to actually hear it, because the processing delay is so long. At first, like when we first met and I would say, "What?" he thought I didn't hear him, and so he'd repeat himself. But the processing delay is actually so bad for me that my husband has learned not to repeat himself when I say "what," and instead just give me a few extra seconds to process it. This may not seem like executive dysfunction, but it absolutely is. For example, in the workforce, suppose someone's talking to you, and then another person is trying to talk to you as well. Now, maybe neurotypicals would be great at switching in between these two conversations. For autistics, this is extremely stressful. Because not only is it hard for us to change our routine, or is it hard to switch from one task to another, that transition period is really tough on us, but we're also trying to process all of this information that literally no one else perceives or even notices. I'll give you an example. At my work, every single morning, morning doves sing overhead. I am the only person in the entire office to hear this, and it's not just that I have great hearing. It's not that. I do have great hearing, but I can't filter any of it out. So these morning doves will be singing, and then the vacuum cleaner will turn on, and then I'll have people talking to me, asking questions, and I hear the electricity, and I hear the air conditioning, and I hear like 100 other things. It's a very stressful experience to take in all this detail that no one else notices. And then it's kind of frustrating because people don't really understand why you can't seem to stay focused on one particular topic. Or, "Hey, I'm talking to me, why aren't you paying attention?" It's like, well, it's kind of hard to pay attention when I can hear the refrigerator running. Hopefully that resonates with some of you. But there are many other forms of executive dysfunction that I'd like to talk about too. So a short list of all the types of executive function in autism for your reference here. Planning, problem solving, working memory, attention, reasoning, initiation, inhibition, cognitive flexibility, and monitoring. This is a short list. There are many more executive dysfunctions, I can assure you. One example that I have is walking directly to my car. That, for the first time in my life, happened about 3 weeks ago. I was kind of blown away. I actually parked my car, I went to the gym, and I came back and I walked straight to my car. This almost never happens. Usually, I look across the entire parking lot, can't remember anything about where I parked my car, and it's not, to be clear, it's not because I'm not paying attention. I am. I actually am. And a lot of people deal with this. So in autism, working memory is so bad. I don't know how to stress this enough. Neurotypicals do not understand what it's like to have such a poor working memory. I'll meet someone and they'll tell me something about them and I'll forget it within 5 minutes. And it's not that I don't want to remember, it's that I can't. And it's really hard. It's really hard dealing with that because at some point you get a boss saying, "You really should learn how to improve your memory," or other scenarios of kind of neurotypical gaslighting in a way. And it's really tricky. And so I think that another thing I'd like to talk about for executive dysfunction is that when we try to plan things, it's a very different experience. So when we try to plan things, it can be tricky to understand what is the first step and what is the last step. So the way that I, as an autistic, see a problem, I kind of see it all at once. I see the problem, and then at the same time I see all 75 solutions that could fix the potential problem. And then I see all of the different details within each of these 75 solutions. And it is a very detailed sensory experience living as an autistic, especially an autistic woman in particular. And so a lot of people think that's amazing, and it's really wonderful to have that kind of understanding and acceptance because I see details that no one else notices. If there's a bug in the code, I see it. In fact, I find bugs without even looking half the time because patterns just pop right out at me. This is one strength of autism, having excellent pattern recognition and being able to see these details up front. However, it makes it really hard to see the big picture. So I actually realized that when I drive, the reason that I get lost all the time. Literally, I need a GPS to go anywhere. It doesn't matter if I've been there 14 times, I still need a GPS to get there. And so I figured out the reason behind it. The reason behind it was that subconsciously over the years, I realized that my reaction time was so bad. And because my reaction time was so bad, I spent all of my focus looking at the car in front of me instead of paying attention to the world around me in that moment. Because it was more important to make sure I'm not going to run into the car in front of me than to know that there's a Whataburger on the side of the road. And so all these little things add up and make it so that I don't have a map anymore, where I have to use a GPS just to get to work, until very recently when I started finding ways of healing and rewiring my brain, and it's been working, and I'm healing, and it's been amazing. However, I think that there is this false perception that neurotypicals have of these problems in autism. Either people think that we're lazy, people think we're not trying hard enough, people think that we're trying to be annoying, people think that we easily could shift our attention if we truly wanted to. And so there's a lot of invalidation that goes along with it, and it's really frustrating to deal with that. One other example that I have of executive dysfunction is cognitive flexibility. So, suppose a neurotypical is working on a problem or a solution to a problem. They can see the big picture, and they can figure out how everything fits together, how all of the individual components fit together to create the problem statement, and they can start from there. In autism, it's very different. In autism, you have to kind of do this backwards way of thinking, where you see all the details, you see all the paths, all the possibilities all at once, but yet you kind of have to piece together the big picture, because the big picture is not immediately clear, and not only that, it's very difficult to see for us. So it would be like a neurotypical walks outside and sees a car. The autistic person walks outside and sees the wheels, sees the steering wheel, sees the motors, sees the color and the paint of the car, sees the bugs on the windshield, if there are any, sees the type of the car, sees the headlights of the car, all of these parts all at once. But to actually realize that what we're seeing is a car kind of requires a conscious level of effort. And that extra step doesn't happen with neurotypicals. And so there are so many things I could talk about with executive dysfunction, because it's a pretty huge part of my life. It would be nice to be able to walk into a party and not think that when someone says, "Oh, Kelsey, you missed out on the costume party," to know that they're not talking about a costume party by default. Obviously, when I give it a few minutes to kick in, I realize, oh, there's actually no costume party. They were just saying that because they wanted attention on their new shirt. But these kind of things make it really not only awkward, but tricky to deal with. Because people think that we're taking it literally on purpose when we have no alternative framework. Another thing that I have to talk about with executive dysfunction is cleaning and grooming. Grooming specifically. So sensory issues can make it really difficult to have a regular cleaning routine for some people. So for me, one of my sensory issues is washing my face in the morning. And I know it's a good day for sensory stuff when I can wash my face without too much trouble. And I know it's a bad day if I just can't do it. And so to the neurotypical, most people might hear this and think, wow, she can't even wash her face. She must be so lazy, or so insert whatever adjective you want to judge me there. But that's actually not at all what it is. It is like physical pain. When you're dealing with sensory issues on a day where everything seems overwhelming, washing your face is the last thing on the list that you want to do. And so then this sensory issue can actually create more executive dysfunction that kind of builds up like an avalanche. There's so many things that become so overwhelming so quickly that you can't focus on all the little things that maybe they don't matter once or twice, but then over time they do matter. One other thing I'd like to talk about is food. So I discovered pretty recently that one of my sensory issues is that I don't like having a super full stomach after I eat. So I realized that I actually eat less than I should sometimes because that feeling is so unpleasant to deal with. And so maybe to some people they might think that's a good thing, right? Who wouldn't want to lose weight or stay skinny or whatever? But the problem is that if you don't eat enough for a meal, then your blood sugar crashes and then it spikes back later on, and then you're starving, even though you've just quote unquote eaten lunch, and then you start craving sugar. And sugar is where the problem starts. You eat a bunch of sugar, and the problem just keeps repeating itself. And to make things even worse, sugar is inflammatory, which causes even worse autistic symptoms. So it's this whole chain reaction of things. What started as a simple sensory issue, aka not wanting a full stomach, resulted in a level of executive dysfunction that can be hard to recognize. So a lot of the executive dysfunctions that autistic people deal with are not necessarily because of the functions themselves, but they're rather side effects of other things. Another thing that autistics deal with is any kind of social inhibition. So I remember when I was a kid, at some point school showed me a book, basically don't talk to strangers, and it didn't make any sense to me. I was like, why wouldn't you talk to strangers? Like, what could possibly go wrong? I only really had positive interactions with strangers for so much of my life. And in fact, I think that those positive interactions reduced my social inhibition even more. I have absolutely no qualms about going up to some random stranger and talking to them about whatever it is that they want to talk about. And at some point, that kind of became a part of my social algorithm, which I'll talk about in another podcast. But I think that sometimes this lack of social inhibition can lead us into some very dangerous situations because we not only have the delayed emotional response of a dangerous scenario, but also we don't have the inhibition required to stay out of these situations sometimes. One relatively harmless example that I'll give is, let's say you're talking to your friends, and one of your friends says, "That is so cool, tell me everything about how your night went." So maybe the neurotypical would be like, okay, cool, they're interested, we'll give them a sentence or two. So in autism, that's not how we think. When someone says, tell me every aspect of how your night went, we take it literally. And so we will literally info dump how the night went, 4 paragraphs even, a lot of times, unless we have rules in the social algorithm to prevent this. And it's kind of unfortunate in a lot of ways that these rules are necessary for us to develop to be able to exist in society. I can't tell you how absolutely refreshing it is to talk to other people who are also neurodivergent, because every time I'm just like, I feel so understood. We're on the same wavelength, and I don't have to worry about being judged or have any rules to prevent me from texting the way that feels natural to me. And so many people might think, why not just text that way to everyone? But the truth is that if you send a really long email, no one's going to read it. So we go through life with specific rules for every single situation. It's quite algorithmic, actually. It almost feels like I'm a robot trapped in a world of humans. And this idea and sentiment across autistics has been pretty shared from what I've found on Reddit. And so all of these things that are easy for neurotypicals to do, say holding things well, drinking water well, walking, these multitasking items that most people would find incredibly easy, can be extremely difficult for people who are autistic, because of all of the information that is continually being presented to us that we can't filter out. So things get so overwhelming that it almost feels like 70% of the brain power goes to focusing on everything else. These executive dysfunctions are just a few of the drawbacks within autism. And of course, there are a pretty significant list of strengths in autism as well, and I will be continuing to talk about that in future episodes of this podcast. But for now, I ask you to kindly consider the idea that not everyone sees life the way that you do. Not everyone is capable of what you're capable of, and if someone does things differently than you, there is probably a totally valid reason why. If someone can't do things that you think are easy, before you judge them on it and before you say something like, you should be able to do this by now, don't say that. And instead, think about the fact that maybe, just maybe, they're different from you. And that's okay. Maybe their strengths are different from yours. Maybe their weaknesses are different from yours. The truth is, if you want to succeed in life, you should be surrounded with people who complement your strengths and weaknesses. That type of diversity, not only neurodiversity, but diversity across the board, is crucial to have a successful society.